Hello, everyone. Welcome to Practical TCP. So, whenever you're designing or operating with event-driven systems, or if you have anything to do with streaming workload, typically you would need to use some sort of message queue. You're probably already aware the very popular ones, such as Kafka. In the Google Cloud environment, the go-to option is typically Cloud PubSub, and simply because it is just very easy to get started and using, you don't really have to know much about it. But one of the things which many engineering teams don't really consider upfront is what happens when something goes wrong. And this is one of the very important things with real-time, near real-time, event-driven systems, because it's not like the traditional batch workload. If something goes wrong, you can't just go back and replay. And let's say loading a file, putting some SQL queries from a database. It doesn't work like that, right? So in today's session, I will talk about how do you replay messages with Cloud's PubSub, and how and when you should start thinking about and designing your systems to make sure, even up front, before this kind of issues happens, you're well prepared for those kind of issues or incidents or deployments. So why is it important to consider replaying messages in an event-driven system? And why is this important specifically when you may want to consider them upfront before something goes wrong, right? So first of all, keep in mind that with Cloud PubSub, at subscription level, as soon as the messages are acknowledged by your consumer, so the code that runs that actually consume those messages, the messages are immediately deleted by default from those subscribers. And this is the default behavior. And the reason is actually quite obvious, because if you have a lot of subscribers, these subscribers, they all retain messages already, right, before they get acknowledged. If you retain them after they've got acknowledged, you are basically duplicating all of this message all over the place, and that can cost you a lot of money. Um, so, so keep this in mind. So there are typically two things and why you really want to consider this upfront. And one is when you're thinking about recovering from a bad deployment. So when you make code changes, right? So in these real time or near real time subscribers, um, if you make a mistake, right? If you make a mistake, the messages in the message queue have already been consumed. They have already been acknowledged, right? As I mentioned, by default, these are deleted from the subscription. You can't really easily just go back and then recover from those incidents, right? So the damage that's been done is already done. So, and that can be quite tricky if you don't think about this upfront, because it's going to result in a pretty bad incident, which you literally do not have an easy way to resolve. The other thing is, obviously, the first option is reactive. You always need it because it's for disaster recovery. Something can always go wrong on production. The second thing here is about a more proactive approach, right? So, or you just basically want to test something new. If you have some new code changes, let's say you didn't want to push them to the production environment yet because you want to see the behaviors of those code, what you can do is to replay the messages on a, let's say, UAT environment, right? By applying a mechanism with Cloud PubSub to replay those messages, then you can see the expected behavior with the messages you already know from production that's been currently being processed by the production code, right? So with your new version of the code, you can now see, actually this is good or this is bad, and then you can actually make your adjustment and rerun those replays as many as times you like before you push your code to production. So to make this a bit easier to understand, I put this diagram together here. So if you look at the very left, so by default, you would have this PubSub subscription created and is configured as act and forget. This basically means as soon as any of these downstream subscribers consume the messages, and which basically mean acknowledge them, right? So basically say you process this message one at a time. And then immediately those messages are deleted from the subscription. So this obviously can cause problems. If you look at the top scenario, this is the first thing I was describing earlier. If something bad happened here, which I'm referring to a bad deployment specifically, you would have downstream systems such as a BigQuery table that expect certain data to come in there. It could be powering reporting, could be powering other workloads that are mini batches, or batch workload for data modeling, for ML use cases, right? So those will stop running immediately. And then if you got APIs, and then there could be use cases you would expect or even have latency requirement that you need to call those APIs to do certain things using this service subscriber. But if something's gone wrong, then you will either get stuck or started doing something different. Let's say you remove the line of code, and the intended output would no longer be the correct one, right? So, and now you want to say, look, I want to recover from this by replaying something that happened since my last bad deployment, and by default, you cannot do that because the default configuration is acknowledge and forget, right? So this is why you want to think about it early before this sort of things happens. In the bottom use case, as I mentioned earlier, this is more proactive, right? So typically with your unit testing, integration testing, and the things that you run in your CI environment with your SIT environment to run, synthetic testing with the input and output, that usually doesn't cover all of the use cases. Maybe you'll do 70, 80%, but it won't do 90% plus, right? So what we typically do is on a UAT environment, what you can do is once you have this turned on, obviously, you can replay those messages on the messages you already been processed, right? Already been processed on production on UAT again. And because typically UAT is a mirror of production, but with certain things turned off, so there's no customer impact. But you can still see whether the code has been running or not with those real messages coming from the upstream systems, typically in this subscription, right? So again, here you can see if this is actually used as default, then you won't have the ability to actually replay any of this stuff, right? So that's why it's very important to consider early before incident happens to be proactive, especially in this case with the event-driven systems. So there are two ways you can replay the messages that have already been acknowledged. Right. So the first option is retention, to turn on retention at a subscription level. So once this is enabled, it will allow you to retain all of the messages even after they have been acknowledged. So you can actually go back, replay them from a point in time in the past, right? So the other option is basically on demand. The snapshots are basically on demand. You create a snapshot whenever you need it, and then you can actually go back to any of these snapshots being created on demand to then replay all of the message from that snapshot all the way to right now, right? That's the two options you have. I'll go into more details about this. So let's look at retention in a little bit more detail first. Think this as a timeline representing all of the messages being received in your subscription from day 0, which are the oldest messages, into day 7, which are your latest messages. I put in here between 7 and 31. This is because you can, by default, it's 7 days retention for all of the messages being unacknowledged. And you can actually adjust this to up to 31 days to give a lot longer for the retention. So keep in mind, this is not for free, right? You have to pay for the storage cost in there. But you can actually do it. So once you enable retention for acknowledged messages, this will correlate to exactly this timeline. So what that means is at any point, you would be able to revert, right, back to any of these point in time. So keep in mind, this is based on a timestamp. So let's say if you want to go here, you basically put a timestamp in here and it will replay all of the messages from this point onwards. However, this solution isn't actually my preferred solution, primarily for two reasons. One, if you think about this whole thing, right, from day 0 to day 7 or even 31 days, if you turn on retention for acknowledged messages, it really depends on how many subscriptions you have got from the same topic, right? If you have a lot or you have a lot of data, this could cost you a lot because the storage cost is not cheap when you actually multiply this to a lot of subscriptions you have, right? So keep in mind, it's all duplicated. The other thing is because it's time-based. The problem with time-based is that let's say you want to go back, you see an issue right now, right? And you want to go back to the previous point in time to replay the messages. you have to find a way or deploy something as part of your pipeline to correlate the timestamp of your deployment with the timestamp that you need to roll back the checkpoint to, right? Because it's time based. So it's okay, but what you have to do is you have to, let's say this is the point you did the deployment, but you have to go a little bit back, right? You need to do before that point, because if you do after, you're going to lose some data, and that's really bad, right? Because it's not going to solve your problem. So typically, you fix your code, you look at when the deployment that happened, when this problem started happening, you rewind it to a little bit earlier than this point, and then you replay based on time all the way to right now, right? But instead, if you look at the snapshot, which is working in a very different way, as I mentioned earlier, this is on demand. So basically, you can create a snapshot 0, 1, and 5 whenever you need it. And this is typically integrated with your deployment, so such as the CI/CD process, right? And the way it works is quite different, right? So you don't use date and time anymore. So whenever you say, look, now I'm doing a deployment, just before I push the code to production, I'm going to make a snapshot, right, in my CI/CD pipeline. So again, from day 0, let's say you make your snapshot 0 in here, and then at some point, let's say here, right, you realize there is a problem with your code, right? Let's say 1 hour, 2 hours after you did the deployment, you simply go back to snapshot 0 and replay everything. So you don't really have to try to correlate yourself on what to go back to, because this is all tightly integrated with your deployment pipeline, your CI/CD pipeline. So it's much easier to roll back. The other thing that is very useful with the snapshot approach is that you don't always turn on retention for the whole subscription, right? So this means the cost is much, much lower, right? So there's a number of things you need to think about. One is not all subscriptions will need this kind of replay behavior, right? Some of these could just be fire and forget. It's fine, right? So if it's analytics workload, if there's something you just only care about what happened in the last, let's say 10, 20 minutes for streaming workload, you don't really have to do this. This is only useful or important for critical workload that if something goes wrong, let's say transactions, right? So in the example later on, I'll show you, it's based on transactions. And then you have to go back. You can't, even one message going wrong is not an option. With those kind of scenarios, you do have to think about how do you go back to an earlier point of deployment, right? So what that means is, let's say you have 20 subscriptions from the same topic from 20 teams. What that means is basically not every team will need to enable the whole thing, right? If you not enable the whole thing, then it's going to cost you a lot of money. But just in case, you can always say, every time I do a deployment, I'm just going to enable this, right? If my pipeline is actually important, if I need to replay some of these messages, then you only do it when you need it. So you don't have to retain all of the unacknowledged messages in the entire subscription, which saves you a lot of money, right? So, okay. Obviously, I made my point there. So snapshot is my preferred more useful option, and it's more cost effective. It's purely based on my experience and what I see in the past years. And typically what you want to do is replay, right? If something goes wrong, you want to replay. And that can be summarized into 3 things. The key things are, you can integrate with your CI/CD pipeline with your snapshot just before the deployment. The other thing is, you will know the exact point to replay it from. So obviously with your CI/CD pipeline, you did the snapshot, and now with your replay process, you can easily go back to that exact point. So it's not like an estimate, right? It's exactly the point you said, look, now I'm doing deployment, I've got a nice snapshot, and I go on, right? And it's cost effective because you only create it when you need it. Like I said, not all the pipelines will need this sort of stuff. Only the more critical ones will. So this will give you the option to to save cost, right? So if you don't do deployment, there's simply no snapshot required, because from what I see most of the time, only deployment would cause this kind of problems. It's rarely just something will just go wrong. You need to replace messages. That doesn't really happen. So here I've created an example on how to use snapshot to replay your subscription, right? So this is specifically focusing on snapshot. And as I mentioned earlier, that this is my preferred way to do replay. Specifically, it's designed for disaster recovery, when something goes wrong, then you can actually easily go back to the previous checkpoint, which is a snapshot in this case, to replay all of the messages from that point onwards, right? So here you can see I've created the all of the infrastructure. So this includes the uh, topic, the subscription, and the cloud run function itself. So all in one place. So this is just much easier for you to run the Terraform, and then so you can actually now use the code to trigger the consumption. So I've also created a example Python file. So what this does is it gives you a way to use the generated like fake transactions. If you remember earlier, I was talking about this is mostly useful, the replay, for very highly critical use cases where you cannot afford to even lose a single message. So if you have a quick look in the fake transaction.json line, you can see this is simulating four different states for a transaction that it would get changed from one to another, right? So majority of these values won't change, but then see things like timestamp and the other fields may change throughout pending, paid, shipped, and delivered. So I've actually unpacked this using a JSON format, so you can see you've got all of these in a structure in this earlier packed in a JSON line, but here I'm just unpacking it so you can see exactly what's in the detail, right? So, and this is kind of a typical message you would get from, let's say, representing a state of a single transaction. I specifically left the transaction ID out of here is because in the Python code, I was dynamically generating that to simulate a lot of these, messages with different IDs going through those states. So I can actually see is coming through in a much nicer way for lots of different transactions. But yeah, the code is here, and you can have a look yourself. And this is in the normal repo of practical GCP example. So you can just find it in the pub/sub replay folder, right? So yeah, so you have all of the details in here from the Terraform, the example to produce messages into the topic, and then you have the way to create a snapshot, and then you have the way to seek the snapshot with doing a replay, right? So there's some very convenient commands you can use, and which you can obviously easily build into your systems to do this kind of stuff as part of your pre-deployment or deployment pipeline, right? So what I want to show you is what I've done so far. If you look at the topic, so the one the most relevant to us is this transaction state event. So this is the topic that I've been sending a lot of these fake transactions into with those four states. There's another one that is relevant here, which is the transaction function trigger. This is just something you can see in the Terraform, is something I've created to use event talk to trigger the Cloud Run function to then do the pool subscription. So just keep in mind, so all of this code, right, is focusing on the pool subscription. I do in the demo will show you the push subscription as well, but that's kind of use something I've created previously. It's not in the code here. All I want to demo to you is that it doesn't matter if you use pull subscription or the push subscription, the behavior is very similar, right? With some small differences, but the behavior is very, very similar, right? So yeah, so this topic is the most relevant one. And then also I've got subscriptions. You can see the ones with the push and the one with the pull, right? So those are the two subscriptions that I've been playing around with and creating a snapshot from, right? So now, if you look at what I've done so far, this is kind of interesting, right? So this is the pool subscription, which I mentioned. I didn't create the code for this, use the previous one, but it is actually derived from that transaction topic, right? It's just a different subscription that is a push one. So you can see what I've done earlier today. This is quite interesting. So initially, I was pumping a bunch of messages into here in a more kind of a steady pace, right? And then later on, what I did was I reset the subscription back to a snapshot I created from an earlier state, right? Now you can see this goes very high in terms of traffic, right? There's a huge spike in here. And that is because as soon as you do that, all of the messages in the subscription would be almost instantly pushed into your subscriber. So this is the same with pool subscription as well. So keep in mind that one of the important things to that you need to check is to make sure your, in this case is a Cloud Run instance. This actually can scale. So if you have any other downstream system that this thing can call, let's say APIs, or send it to somewhere else, you need to make sure it is able to handle this sort of back pressure. But usually most systems you can. This shouldn't be a problem, especially if you're using the cloud native services. This is the log, as you can see. These are pushed, so you get the 200 response. As soon as you get that, it basically acknowledged, and then the message is no longer, in the. So it's basically being processed, right? So, if you want to replay them again, you basically do another seek that goes back to. You can go to the same snapshot again if you prefer. This is the metric, another metric with the pool subscriber. So you can see again, this is something, it's quite interesting. So the behavior is the same. You get a lot of messages, but what you did also get was the latency has been increased quite a lot. And that's because this huge amount of messages came through. I believe I only used one. Yeah, I think in this case, I only used the one subscriber. So it was quite slow to process those messages. But you can obviously deploy this to have multiple Cloud Run functions running at the same time to balance the consumption of the messages. And again, this you can see is something I was just logging out the ID of those messages. You can see it's been through all of these different stages. These are different message IDs. And then here you can see it just stormed like 600 messages straight away into the consumer. So it was just processing that with this one consumer. So what I want to do now is that if I go back to, let's say I think I'll do both, right? So let's do the push subscription first, so it's because it's easier to see what is coming through. You can obviously use the command line, but what you can also do is to replay the messages from here, from the GUI. You can see this is the seek. With seek, you have two options, right? One is to go to the previous time or previous timestamp. So this is the one I was referring to the earlier with the retention, right? So you can retain everything within the subscription, and then you kind of go back to a point. Because I have not turned this one on, that's why it's grayed out, right? So the one I'm going to show you is the snapshot. So I've created, you can see, 4 different snapshots earlier, and then I'm going to pick one of the earliest ones to replay in a second. But one thing I want to cover here is the important point. So this kind of happened to me as well, but if you think about it, it immediately makes sense why it's done like this. So you see there are 2 subscriptions I've got, right? One is for the push and one is for the pull, right? Those are very different things. And you can see the importance of naming convention in here. So I've got 2 different kind of naming conventions. So initially when I was creating, I wasn't thinking too much. And now I was really like, okay, this is important that you need to actually think about the naming convention. Because what actually is happening is when you create a snapshot, any snapshot, right? So you can apply snapshot to any, right? To any subscriptions. So let's say in this case, if you just create something called deployment timestamp, you would literally have no clue where this is being created from, right? It's very difficult to tell where this is coming from. But if you create it with something like this, so in this case, I'm following the naming convention of the subscription name, followed by, in this case, is the context that is done at the deployment time, and then you have the timestamp, right? So in this case, you know immediately when and for what and which subscription this snapshot has been created from, right? This is very important because when you apply this, it doesn't matter where you created it from. You can apply it to any subscriptions you like. So you might be wondering, okay, why is that? Can't you, if you're just gonna recover and doing replay, wouldn't you always apply this to the same subscription, right? Why would you apply to a different subscription? Well, yes and no, right? So sometimes you want to replay to try it out first, right? Sometimes you just want to do a fix of the code. Think about the logic here. So if something is broken because of a previous broken deployments. So the thing you're going to do first of all is to fix the code, right? Because you fix the code. Let's say the logic was a problem. You fix the code. You deploy the code to UAT. What you might want to do is to replay the topic to a different one, right? Let's say on the UAT one or on a different one, just to see if the code is working as expected when you replay that, and before you push that into production, right? You may not always want to apply this into the original production subscription, and sometimes other times you might want to just apply that to a different BigQuery subscription, yeah. And then that can actually send all of these messages into BigQuery, so you can actually see, oh, why was it broken? You can actually look at the messages to that might help you with debugging. So this probably is most important reason why the Google has given you the option to apply this to different kind of subscriptions. But it is important for you to understand. It's important to make sure your naming convention is spot on, right? So I'm just going to do this for you so you can see this is happening. So this is actually 1 o'clock, and this is 1 o'clock. I think this one is the most recent, the earliest one, right? So if I do a seek on this particular one, right, I'll let that happen, and in the meantime I'll do the other one, right? So it's going to take a bit of time for this to show up in the user interface. Now I'm going to go to the pool one. I'm going to replay the messages and apply the same one in here as well. I'm doing a seek, right? So keep in mind you don't have to do this in the UI, but for a production use case, this might actually be quite handy. If you know in an urgent scenario, you just want to replay, and you can actually do it here. There's nothing wrong with it, right? Because the snapshot is already created. This is the built-in functionality. So now, if you look at the metric, let's look at the last 30 minutes. Let's see if it comes through. This one might take a bit of time, but let's look at the logs. So now you can see is already all of these are coming through, yeah? So there's loads of messages coming through. So those are the messages, because I've not put any new messages in there, right? That's just the ones that from what I created like maybe 6-7 hours ago. That is just basically coming through and being processed in the Cloud Run part. But what I found is that the UI is always taking a bit of time to update. So I don't think I will see this for a while until it kind of come through when it's finished processing. On the other side, this is I'm going to put this back in again for the last 30 minutes for Cloud Run functions. So the way this works, if you look at this, there's nothing coming through yet, right? And there's a reason for it, because the way I did the Cloud Run function is triggered by event talk. And that event talk event is actually generated from a pops up topic, which is the trigger. Right, this is a quite common way to do this. So rather than using a cloud scheduler, I'm just basically using a trigger. So whenever I want this to be triggered to to spin up my cloud functions, one or multiple, I can actually publish. In this case, I can just do an empty payload, right? And then it'll go to the other side, and it will trigger the cloud function. So yeah, I'm gonna give that a bit of time. This will take a bit of time to coming through. You can see now it's coming through. So yeah, that's the one, and it will start processing. There you go, right? So I've given you a batch of 100, I think, but yeah, but it's basically just it's processing, is going through all this, right? So same as the push side. So if I have a look at this one again with an auto refresh, yeah, you see it's gone up and then it's now finished, gone out. And then if you look at this one, still not really coming through. Yeah, but you get the idea. The log is showing is all processed. It's just the UI is lagging behind a little bit. Okay, I think that's what I want to show you in the demo. Yeah. So this is how you would manage replay in a production environment. So if you run into situations like this and you need all of these messages to be replayed, you can easily just use the GUI once the snapshot is created to go back to that point, and or choose a different snapshot, because as long as you follow a good naming convention like what I did earlier, it would give you a very easy way to identify which snapshot you would want to go back to and replay all of the messages. Okay, now let's have a look at everything we talked about today. So first of all, it is really important to prepare for the unexpected, right? So don't wait for when you actually have a production incident to start thinking about how to replay your messages. I've actually heard feedback from some of the engineers of feeling this is actually a, they're worried about PubSub's capability to replay messages, or if they don't know if there is capabilities like this, like Kafka, very similar to Kafka, to replay the messages. And the answer is yes, you do have it, and there's two ways to do it. Choose wisely on what you want to use. But from my perspective, if your main purpose is to actually prevent or running the disaster recovery processes, the snapshot based one is much easier to deal with, right? And you have all built in, including the UI, so you don't have to faff around with all of the other integration options, to go back to, right? So obviously the other one is valid as well, with the retention set to the whole thing, but just keep in mind of some of the downside I mentioned about the cost. But one thing you do have to remember is the default option is have this turned off. So as soon as you acknowledge any of these messages, whether it's push or pull subscription or any subscriptions, the message will disappear from the subscription if you don't change the default behavior or if you don't make a snapshot, right? So second thing is retention versus snapshot. If you, as mentioned, I would prefer snapshot because that's the main purpose of why I think this is useful for disaster recovery, replay all of the stuff. But retention has longer TTLs up to 31 days, which I don't know why, but Snapshot does not have it, right? So the retention does have a longer span if you actually interested in retain the messages for longer for the ones that have already been acknowledged, right? So, but other than that, I think Snapshot is still much easier in my view. The few things you want to watch out though. So I did cover those on and off throughout the session today. But first, snapshot expires after 7 days, right? So keep in mind this is looks like a hard one, a hard deadline. So if you have created something and after 7 days, the snapshot will be gone, right? It won't be there anymore. So you can't actually use it. So don't expect, let's say you run something for 10 days, right? And then after a deployment, and you can still go back to that for 10 days. In my experience, this is very unlikely in a production environment unless what you're doing is extremely not important, right? So usually you find things that is a problem in real-time systems after an hour or less, and sometimes 1 day maximum. 7 days, no one noticed there's a problem. I mean, I've never seen that before, right? So, but do make sure you have monitoring, right? Because if it's broken behind the scenes, you don't even know about it. I rely on the users to complain, and that's not a very good way to set up operations, right? So snapshots, any snapshot can be replayed on any subscription. So this is the thing I demoed to you in the sense of I've deliberately created two naming conventions to show you the difference, right? So because you can apply any of these into anywhere, right? In the UI, you can do it, but when you have a lot of subscriptions, I think especially depend on what permission you've got. So that would determine what you can see. But the naming convention is always important. So you know when you're applying for it, where it actually goes into. I think one of the good things to do in here is you can build this into your disaster recovery pipeline. So it won't allow you to apply anything that is not from the original subscription or created from the original subscription if you prefer, right? So I think that if that's how you want to work, and because in my view, that's majority of the time you would want to do something like that, then you can set it like that, right? The naming convention is important. The other thing is to make sure your downstream system can handle the back pressure, right? So you saw the spikes and the latencies I put in there. So if you have a downstream system, usually my recommendation is don't pick a peak time to do this kind of stuff, right? Unless you don't have a choice, right? If something is broken on production, then you have to fix it. That's really, really key. But if this is not the case and you just need to fix it, you realize there's a kind of a problem, but it can wait, and don't do it at peak time, because as soon as you do that, it's gonna push all of the messages from your snapshot right to right now. What this means is if you still have live traffic coming through that is very busy at the moment, this could mean you would make your current situation much worse, right? So do keep that in mind. Yeah, I think that's everything. I hope you find this useful. And yeah, I'll see you next time.
Go, go, go out!